Conversations podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Conversations podcast. Today, I am with George Bisas, who is the Director of Language Services for Multicultural New South Wales. Let me tell you a little bit about George, if you don't mind. Now, George has decades of service within the public sector. He was the CEO for VITS, that's the Victorian Interpreting and Translating Service. The newbies would know that as Language Loop these days. And prior to that, he was with the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, worked as a senior advisor to the Hong Kong government, as well as being the CEO of Headway Victoria. Wow, George, thank you so much for all those services along the last few years.
It's a few years, yeah, thank you.
Welcome, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, extremely well. Yeah, look, it's a nice day in Sydney today.
Very good. Nice in sunny Sydney. We're not doing too bad in Melbourne here today as well. Now, according to your website, George, New South Wales is one of the most culturally diverse states in the world, let alone Australia. Residents who've come from more than 307 ancestries, speaking 215 languages and dialects, and following 148 different religious beliefs. Wow, those are some pretty amazing numbers. Tell us, who is Multicultural New South Wales and what does it do?
Multicultural New South Wales is the peak government agency that addresses issues related to multiculturalism. Our key role is to promote social harmony and social cohesion, community harmony and social cohesion. And we do that in a number of ways. We provide policy, research and advice around multicultural issues. We provide a range of grants programs to multicultural communities, and as is probably the key component of this discussion today, we also provide an interpreting and translating service. I suppose we've also got a broader responsibility in the language services area, and we could touch on that a bit later. But its role is actually to ensure that we promote community harmony and do it fairly well, I think, in New South Wales. We provide advice up to a Minister for Multiculturalism, who has responsibility for this portfolio, and try where we can to influence the New South Wales government more broadly in terms of how it works with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and assist the departments and the government agencies to work better with that cohort and ensure that people from CALD backgrounds have the opportunity to access services and programs provided by New South Wales government.
That's one of the things that I found very interesting. In addition to policy and advising governments and departments, you're actually quite hands-on with the services you provide for newly arrivals, aren't you?
Look, we have a fairly substantial settlement team that actually provides a lot of advice to government and NGOs about issues related to newly arrived refugees, particularly in the settlement space. We've also got a fairly strong community engagement responsibility where we've got 12 regional advisory councils are located across metropolitan Sydney and regional New South Wales, where we regularly meet with representatives of community, government, NGOs, individuals in those regions to find out what are some of the issues that are confronting, particularly people from CALD backgrounds, which is obviously our responsibility.
You've got to be a bit of a trendsetter internationally as well, I'm assuming. I mean, we're looking at these numbers here and the work that you do. There's plenty of work to do. Does the New South Wales, Multicultural New South Wales, do you know it to be being an example to other multicultural cities around the world or states?
Oh, look, I think it's fair to say that it's a model that's duplicated in other states of Australia. But I think because of the extreme, I think Victoria, where I'm born and where I come from, and New South Wales are probably the two most multiculturally diverse states. Look, I think some of the programs are interesting in that they provide support to communities. We may talk about some supports we provided during the current COVID pandemic, and other supports that are provided. We provide supports and grants and advice around areas which other other parts of the world may find very beneficial, because it's about successfully integrating people from core backgrounds into Australia and into New South Wales.
So how does the language services fit into Multicultural New South Wales?
We've got two roles where language services is concerned. We have a direct delivery role where we provide we're actually a language service provider, and we provide a range of services. We can talk about that in a moment. But we also have probably just as important a role, which is a policy role in New South Wales to ensure the sustainability of the language services industry in New South Wales. What are the issues? What are the concerns around the provision of language services in New South Wales that the government needs to be aware of and the government needs to respond to? About 5 years ago, the Minister, on my advice, established a language service advisory forum in New South Wales. It's a forum that's made up of the educators, the TAFE and universities in New South Wales and Sydney that currently provide training in the interpreting and translating space. It's also made up of people that have high usage of interpreters and translators. The departments like health, justice, the courts, the police are all represented. It includes the key interpreter and translator agencies like OSIT, like NATI are involved as well. All of these providers, all these groups, and anyone that has a key involvement, and of course the providers themselves. We have TIS National, Centrelink, all graduates are involved. Your CEO Ismail is a regular contributor. On-Call, our SPS, and a couple of other of the larger private providers, as well as the larger government providers in New South Wales.
How often do you meet?
We were meeting on a quarterly basis. We found the need during COVID to meet a bit more regularly, but it's been going now for about 4 years, and it's an opportunity and a forum where all of those that have an investment in the language service industry in New South Wales can come together. I was a little bit interested when I first arrived that a number of people that work within this industry at any of those levels hadn't had an opportunity to meet regularly with each other and talk to each other about what some of the concerns are within New South Wales. And it was a really useful opportunity to bring together. I'm fortunate that I get to chair it and I get to hear a lot of what goes on in New South Wales. But to give you an example of some of the things that come out of it, probably one of the key outcomes that came out of it was that there were no guidelines in New South Wales for the effective and appropriate use of interpreters and translators, particularly for New South Wales government and for funded agencies by New South Wales government. And that was seen as a bit of a shortcoming, particularly by the departments, particularly by the interpreter groups. So Multicultural New South Wales went down the path of developing, consulting extensively with industry, and developing for the first time New South Wales guidelines that are now available to all government departments, to all funded non-government agencies and anyone else that finds that they're of use, which talks about everything from the procurement of language services right through to the effective use of language services in New South Wales. And we thought it was critical for New South Wales government agencies in particular and departments to have a resource of that nature that was available to them. That came from the forum. Probably what else came to the forum was, again, from the agencies themselves, the providers themselves, was the challenges they were having in sourcing interpreters in a range of languages. Now, I know this is not a problem that's unique to New South Wales. My work in Victoria, I was certainly aware that there are issues there. And there were two key areas that there were which are problematic in terms of delivering interpreting services. One is the languages spoken in the new and emerging communities, often the refugee or the settlement communities, and probably not surprising to you and to all graduates, but increasingly challenging ways of getting interpreters in some of the more established languages. Some of the languages in communities that have been here in the 50s and 60s, where the interpreter groups are ageing, and yet those communities are ageing and still require the support of interpreters, often in aged care settings, and
if not more now than before.
Precisely, as they return to their native tongue, and the availability of interpreters is not there. So we put the concern to the minister and to government, and look, it's fair to say that there were solutions had been reached in other states, and Victoria had a fairly strong and thriving scholarship program, and I thought it would be something that we could probably do in a slightly different way, but we could do here in New South Wales to try to meet the gaps in-service delivery. So, in fact, it got so much prominence that it became an election commitment in the last New South Wales election, the establishment of an interpreter scholarship program in New South Wales.
How is that promise going?
The government that made the promise won the election, and the funds have been allocated, and it's going extremely well. We did a really extensive data search of, again, relying on the information from private providers and government providers, and we identified probably the 35 languages, which were a mix of both languages for new and emerging communities, as well as languages that are being spoken by more established communities, where the providers themselves, both private and government, working actively in New South Wales across Sydney and regional New South Wales, are being challenged in finding interpreters in those languages. So what we've now done is enter into a partnership with TAFE New South Wales, and we've got some support from RMIT in Victoria as well, where we're delivering the training programs. We focused in the first year or two of the program on the new and emerging communities. The reason for that is that the New South Wales has adopted, through the federal government, a policy of settling a lot of refugee communities and new settlement communities in regional New South Wales. And there's been areas like Coffs Harbour, Wagga, Armidale, Albury, areas that have had significant settlement of refugees, but have not have access to interpreters in those languages, in those areas, so that the local communities can actually access the services they require through a qualified interpreter. So
Sorry, George. How do you reach potential candidates, potential students?
Well, we send out an expression of interest through communities, through TAFE colleges, through it's been interesting how it's networked extremely well. We call expression of interest. We have 100 places a year for 4 years is the initial pilot for the 4 years. And in the first year we sent out a request expressions of interest for the first 100 places, and we got over 1,100 applications.
Well, you're definitely reaching them then.
Yeah, we're certainly getting there, and it was a cross section of languages. And look, I'm proud to say that particularly in why we started in the new and emerging languages, or new and emerging community languages, was that we've been able to train and deliver interpreter scholarships to locals in those areas. And Coffs Harbour now has 12 or 14 interpreters in high demand languages in that area, and we're working with Wagga at the moment, where there are 16 interpreters currently being trained, again in high demand languages in those areas. I'm not for one moment suggesting that's going to meet all the need, but we're going from a low base, and we're going to a point where they'll be developed. Next year, we'll move into some of the languages that were identified in the established languages, and they will be things like Greek and Italian. Interestingly enough, Spanish, Macedonian, languages that we can't actually get sufficient interpreters in New South Wales, and we'll run them through a diploma course through TAFE in 2021. So hopefully a number of courses. So yeah, look, hopefully by the end of this program, we'll have 400 new interpreters qualified in New South Wales, with my aim being to go back to government and say this has been fairly successful, and I'd like the money available to be doubled or tripled at that point. So yeah, look, that's part of our role as we've got a systemic policy role. So we have an advisory forum that advises through myself, the Minister and government about where the limitations and issues are in New South Wales in relation to language services. And two of the initiative examples that I've given, there have been others, but the two of them were the guidelines, and the second one was the scholarship program, which both have come to fruition. So for me, it's about listening to the industry, listening to the people who are being impacted upon, and where the need may be, and trying to respond to it as effectively as we can. So that's our first role. Our first role is a systemic role to look at policy issues. There's a number of issues we'll address in the next 12 months, which will be the increasing use of things like machine translations, how that has an impact on translators and the translation industry in New South Wales, the increased use of machine translations, and how we may be able to potentially try to pull that back a bit and start using. I mean, our policy and our guidelines is always it's always more effective to use human translations and human translators and human to interpreters. But I don't think we can completely ignore the fact that machine translations is growing at a rapid rate. And we need to find an effective and an appropriate response to that. And that might be post-machine editing, that might be things of that nature which we need to deal with. So we're looking at that as well in terms of policies. And that's the sort of thing we're looking, for example, we're even going to a point where we're looking at the teaching of language in schools in New South Wales, and the ways in which we can continue to promote the teaching of a second language at schools, and that more and more students are continuing to maintain the second language, which of course has direct relationship to the availability of interpreters in many ways in terms of language. So we do have a policy and systemic role to play in language services, and that's really important. I mean, things like the availability of remote interpreting, telephone interpreting in regional New South Wales. One thing I do know, New South Wales regionally is a lot bigger than my experiences back in Victoria, where you can pretty much drive anywhere in Victoria for about 3 or 4 hours. But Broken Hill and Coffs Harbour and Tamworth and Wagga Wagga and Albury are a long way away from Sydney.
You've got like serious outback there as well, haven't you?
We do. Actually, yeah. So the increased use of remote interpreting has been something that we've had to use as well. So yeah, that's.
Well, let me bring you to that in regards to COVID-19. So majority of the interpreting these days in Victoria is done through remote interpreting, and now that's yes, telephone interpreting as before, but now more and more video remote interpreting as well. I think. Majority of the work is still done face-to-face in New South Wales?
Look, it is because for circumstances that exist at the moment, we're probably more open than Victoria in terms of the courts and in terms of the agencies and government agencies that are open. So yeah, it's still continuing. But when there was lockdown in March, April, May, which was a significant lockdown here in New South Wales, there was the courts were closed and the police, but the police still needed to use interpreters. So there was an increased use of remote interpreting. I must say it's something that it's not foreign to us, because we currently have a network of AVLs or video equipment at all New South Wales courts in regional New South Wales. Mm-hmm. We're looking to do something similar, and we're currently processing a similar project for AVLs in police stations across regional New South Wales. But as I said earlier, travelling to regional New South Wales to appear as an interpreter at court in regional New South Wales requires an aeroplane to fly you there because it's quite a distance. So any opportunity we can get to do remote interpreting. So we have a bank of AVL rooms here in Parramatta, our headquarters, and interpreters can come into those AVL rooms and they can provide interpreting to courts in regional New South Wales. And there's a number of large regional New South Wales centres where they can actually do AVL. So it wasn't something that we weren't doing, that we weren't aware of with the experience. But as COVID hit, as the restrictions hit, particularly in March, April and May, there was a heavier reliance on video interpreting and telephone interpreting. Not my preferred approach, I must say. Telephone interpreting is not my preferred approach in courts. It's not something that we would sanction. We would prefer that it be face-to-face, or at least someone via AVL. But where the courts have reopened, where New South Wales government front sort of office and agencies like Service New South Wales have reopened, then interpreters have begun to return there for face-to-face appointments. Having said that, we make sure absolutely clear to our interpreter base that we want to make sure that where they go adheres to appropriate health and safety practices, social distancing, hygiene, cleanliness, and our interpreters it's made very clear to them that if they believe that it's not like that they should let us know, or at least withdraw from the assignment. So it's really important that they feel comfortable and safe when they're going to these assignments. But you're right, we've opened up a lot more in New South Wales now. So initially there was a lot more remote interpreting. What has actually been we've seen a significant increase in has been the use of translators and translated material during COVID-19. And look, enormous credit to the translators that work for Multicultural New South Wales, because the information was coming in and going out in 35 or 40 languages on a really, really quick basis. And it wasn't unusual, and particularly in the early days of COVID, when there was so much unknown, that the policies and the guidelines were changing quite rapidly.
The terminology as well, it was all new to us.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we would have a situation. We would even have a situation where some guidelines would go out, and they'd go out at 9 in the morning, and they were with the translators to translate. And by about 11 o'clock that morning or 12 noon that morning, they'd rung us to change it because the information had changed and the ideas had changed and the approach had changed. Can we quickly change this? And the translators working for us were exceptional in their responsiveness, in their flexibility, and be able to do that. And we got a lot of information out, and I think I think it's a really big part of informing and getting information out. What also was really critical for us, and this stemmed from the advisory forum that we set up, but also stemmed from the fact that we do a lot of work in the settlement space, is that we were acutely aware that, it's often common, and I'm sure you've got the situation in Victoria, let's do the top 16 languages, which is often your Greeks, your Italians, your Arabic, your Chinese, your Vietnamese, but it was equally as important to get that information out in languages to new and emerging communities, particularly who don't necessarily have the media or the community infrastructure to get that information themselves. So it was really important for us to get that information out to them in any way we can. So that brought up its own challenges, finding translators, particularly qualified translators, to be able to translate material in languages that particularly when ARDI hasn't even tested those languages.
That's right.
For a very long time.
What do you do in regards to quality assurance when there are no certified translators?
Look, we try to get a counterbalance between two translators. Look, if there's one translator can check another translator's work, is probably the only way we can really do it, and that's probably the best way to do it. Can I say that one of the other challenges with new and emerging communities is that it's also very clear that a number of communities don't necessarily have the literacy to read the material that's translated. So we've needed to look at audio and other means of delivering that information and delivering it as quickly as we possibly can, because as I said, the information changes quite rapidly and quite quickly, and there's a demand for it. When we started opening up in June, then the government had a number of guidelines for people like hair salons, nail salons, cafes, and places like that had COVID opening plans or COVID plans, and they needed to be made available in a range of languages really, really quickly. So yeah, look, it was an interesting experience, but I hadn't experienced anything quite so busy. We were literally run off our feet, and we still are to a certain extent, because as you see, every day in most states in Australia, restrictions change, guidelines change constantly, and you're experiencing it in Victoria. But we had another set of announcements today. And once those announcements are made, they've got to get out to all communities. And it's really critical they get out to all communities as quickly as possible.
And as soon as possible.
Absolutely. And that's a really important role for us because we have a really strong communications role too. I should have said that we've got a really strong communications. We also provide 2 sets of awards at Multicultural New South Wales. We've got the Premier's Multicultural Awards, which support prominent and significant contributions to multicultural communities across New South Wales. And I'm pleased to say in the last 2 years, we've introduced an Interpreter Language Services Award.
I believe All Graduates Interpreter won that award last year.
Can I also say, I should thank All Graduates, because All Graduates has sponsored that award for the last 2 years as well. So we're very grateful to All Graduates for doing that. But what it does, and an event, which the event unfortunately wasn't held this year because of COVID, but last year it was held in an audience of 1,200 people. And I think it highlights, it really creates a highlight on the fact that an interpreter or a translator, but a language service professional, is highlighted on the evening and presented with an award from the Premier herself. And it's I think for me, part of the work we need to continue to do across Australia is to continue to promote the value of interpreters and translators and the value of language services across Australia, because it still remains a concern that that government agencies and others think that if you can speak another language that you can be an interpreter, and the value they provide to our community is never. I don't think is always acknowledged as much as it should be. So it was really important that occurred. So that award was one important award. The other important award that we actually sponsor is a literary award, which is the Premier's Literary Awards, which presents awards to a number of different writers and books that are presented. We present 2 awards in that area. We present one where we present an award to any book that's got a strong multicultural theme. And secondly, we present an award to a literary translation award, which is where something has been translated specifically from its other language into English, or the other way around, that is a literary award, which is quite unique, I think, in New South Wales.
I think so. I think so.
That's also something that we're really keen to do, to promote the quality of literature or literary translators in that way.
In addition to providing assistance to organisations as well as working on policy, Multicultural New South Wales Language Services is also a language services provider, right? So
absolutely, yeah. And look, we probably are predominantly a legal provider. We are the key provider for New South Wales courts for interpreting and translating. We also provide interpreting predominantly to the New South Wales Police as well. And Service New South Wales, which is I'm not sure what the equivalent is in other states, but it's the New South Wales government's front of office, where you can go and get everything from a driver's license to a birth certificate to register your business or whatever it may be. So it's a one-stop shop, and we provide interpreting through those services as well. So we do provide interpreting, and plus across a range of other government departments as well. We provide video interpreting, telephone interpreting, and face-to-face interpreting, and of course we provide translations. The other thing we do as a service provider is we provide a fairly extensive personal document translation service. So if individuals want to get a personal document translated, they can go to any one of any Service New South Wales offices in New South Wales, and I think there's about 100 of them across Sydney and regional New South Wales. You can walk in the door and get a document translated through us, through that office, fairly much reasonably quickly. So, yeah, you're right. We do provide a language. We are a language service provider, and that's yep.
So you work with quite a lot of interpreters, translators, practitioners. How many would you have? Would all interpreters, translators in New South Wales be on your panel?
No, we don't. We don't. We've got in somewhere in the thousands in terms of interpreters. The last NATI figure showed there's about 8,000 certified interpreters and translators in New South Wales. I would understand not all of them, a significant number of them are not in the industry, but they're certainly certified. But yeah, look, it's been a fairly solid and stable group of practitioners, because we've been around for probably 30 years, and we've been continuing to provide interpreting and translating, particularly in the courts area and the police area, which is fairly strong legal. So it's a fairly stable group. We introduced telephone interpreting about 2 years ago, and then began to recruit a lot more interpreters, because, as you know, that requires a lot more people on sort of particularly given it's a really strong on-demand service that need to be available, and therefore you need to up the numbers that you've got. And we've recruited a number of them from all over Australia, which is the nature of telephone interpreting. So yeah, we're a language service provider, and and again, as I said, predominantly in the legal space, but increasingly in other areas as well.
What kind of services do you support for your interpreters and translators? How do you support them?
Look, we have an employment assistance program that interpreters can freely make available to themselves. I think a lot of agencies don't necessarily, and I think a lot of people that use interpreters don't fully understand how stressful interpreting can be. And it's really clear in the field that we work in the area that we work in, where they go predominantly to police and to courts in terms of the work they do, that they're dealing with very sensitive, very often graphic, very challenging content. And I think it's fair to say that it has an impact on our interpreters, and it's important that they know we're there to support them in the best way we can. So we do offer a free employment assistance program, which enables them to get access to a counsellor, which is, of course, a qualified psychologist, to work through any issues they may have. We also provide fairly extensive training. One of the things that shifted when NATI changed from its accreditation to its certification system, and our interpreters and translators were not shy in coming forward and telling us the challenges of moving to the certification system, included the requirement to undertake professional development training and acquire professional development points. So we see that as a really critical part of what we do. So we provide our interpreters and our translators with regular training that is signed off by NATI so they can provide CPD points, but also it's training that's very relevant to the work they're doing, whether it's about transcripts for the police, or whether it's about stuff through the Crime Commission, whether it's about court work that they do. We're really keen to do events like that, but also to provide that training. And again, It's at no cost to our interpreters and translators, and it's a twofold positive. One, it provides them with, I think, the skills and the knowledge that they need to do better at the work that they do for us. But also, more importantly, and for them at least, is to also give them the CPD points they need to be able to recertify when required.
How many times a year would you offer these training
opportunities? We do them really regularly. Look, I would say they're probably monthly, if not more regularly. And they're interspersed with special days. Like we just had an event recently for International Translation Day, which happened recently, and we had a number of key speakers come in and have a chat and talk to our and we had, I think, well over 100, if not more than that attended that. And again, it was about focusing on translations. It was focusing on the significance of translations, but also allowing our practitioners to get CPD points with NADI. So they're held very regularly, and I'm really keen to have them more regularly. And if any of the interpreters and translators from Multicultural New South Wales are listening to this, please let your panel manager, Rima, or myself know what other sorts of training you think might be useful for us to deliver.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how do you decide on the topics that are covered? But now you just
we have we have a full-time we have a group of people that manage our panel of interpreters and translators. There's regular communication. There's a regular online newsletter that goes out to our interpreters and translators, and they're regularly asked for their feedback in terms of what we could be doing differently and what sort of training they think they require or they think would be useful in terms of both interpreters and translators.
Magnificent. I just want to take this opportunity to say a big thank you and kudos to the interpreters and translators out there, especially through the COVID-19 era over the last few months. So thank you so much for putting all that extra effort in. You're saying with translators especially, they might be putting out something and then a couple of hours later they might change it all over again, and in one day you might be putting out 3-4 different versions of the same text.
Completely. And look, and I don't underplay the contribution interpreters have made as well. Look, we've had situations in New South Wales where, for example, our New South Wales agencies have had to call returning travellers from various countries, and particularly early on in the pandemic when a significant number of people were returning from China, and we needed to use a huge bank of interpreters to work to assist government agencies calling those individuals to advise them of the requirement to quarantine and things of that nature. In the early days we had to send interpreters to the Sydney airport as well, where they had to welcome and given the appropriate safeguards as well, particularly when they were meeting them person to person at the airport. To talk to them again about the requirements when they're returning, and the work they've continued to do in agencies, even like the police. The role of the police has to obviously continues. Whilst the court shut down for 2 to 3 months, or had limited services for 2 to 3 months, police continued at exactly the same level they've always continued, and so they do need interpreters. So look, a really big call out to interpreters as well. They've both worked remarkably. Both the interpreters and translators have worked remarkably over a really challenging period and made a really significant contribution to ensuring that those communities and the broader community are safeguarded from COVID.
What about contact tracing? Do you provide interpreters for that? How's that been going?
I think they do. We don't provide it. Because on there I can talk about, but I suspect they would need to use interpreters, but it's not an area. I suspect. Look, the other thing about New South Wales, which you may or may not know, but we have a separate health interpreting service.
Yes.
So we have it's probably worked out that Multicultural New South Wales probably does most of the interpreting in the legal space, but we also have a fairly broad network, which is a health interpreting service. And I assume the health interpreting service has helped out where required.
A very lucky state indeed, and I might be a little bit jealous here in Victoria that you've got the government taking care of business over there. So well done. George, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I know you are a very, very busy man, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Lovely. Thank you for. I'm very happy to make myself available. Once again, thanks to all graduates for the support they've provided, both the forum and some of the programs we've had up here.
Thank you, George. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, mate. Cheers. Bye-bye.
All Graduates Conversations Podcast.